Hey everybody, welcome. This is our No New Roads webinar. Thank you for joining us. I see we still have quite a few people still filtering in, so I think we'll give it a few minutes, but Todd is ready to go with his presentation, and we should be ready to go, like I said, in a few minutes. I think we'll let some people keep filtering in here. I did in the chat window. You'll see kind of some quote bubbles on your right side. There's a chat window, and if you go in there, if you're having any issues, seeing the presentation, you should be able to see me on your screen right now talking. I'm wearing a hat because it's pretty cold in my office, unfortunately. But if you're having any trouble, we did post a few quick little troubleshooting messages. The one thing we noticed in the last webinar is one of the simple fixes if you're having any trouble is simply refreshing your screen. And then there's a few other things too. The Chrome browser works best for this. Some people have had a little bit of an issue in Safari. So that could be an issue too. And I should note this webinar will be recorded. So if you do end up missing something or need to come back to it, we will record this and post this on our YouTube page. And I'll send a link out for that. And I know Todd has some materials he'll send out afterward as well. Okay, so let's give it. I'm going to give a few minutes here just to let people keep coming in. Looks like we've still got a nice stream of people joining us. So let's give it just a few more minutes here. All right. Beth is telling me I shouldn't wait too long, so that means we should maybe get going here. I see that we still have some people streaming in, but it looks like it's kind of settled in for now. So I think we will get started. I want to thank everybody for joining us. This is great. We've got some wonderful attendance, and really appreciate everybody jumping on. So without further ado, I want to introduce our presenter today, which is Todd Litman. Todd is with the Victoria Transport Policy Institute. He writes and does a lot of policy research on a variety of topics in the transportation sector. And I think we're going to talk a lot about induced travel and congestion, but I'm sure some other topics will be touched on too. Todd has a pretty broad range of experience and topics he covers, and also areas. I know, Todd, you were just in Dubai, which is pretty interesting. We were chatting about that a little bit yesterday. So, without further ado, I think, Todd, I'll let you jump into it. And I think what we'll do is Todd will do his presentation. I'll open up. There's a question box on your top right. You should see it in kind of this chat box. There's a question box, and I'll enable that. And so what you can do is, if you have a question, type that in there, and we'll get to those at the end of the presentation. And also, if you have any issues, kind of, or any comments as we're going, we do have this chat window as well. So that's a good place to talk and chat a little bit too. And I think with that said, Todd, I'll let you go ahead. Really appreciate having you on here. I've been following your stuff for a while, so this is great to have you.
Thank you very much. Let's see. Now I'm trying to get my slideshow up, and for some reason when I try this screen, the share your screen button, it's not working. So do you have to hand over?
Let's see if that works.
That looks a little bit better. Let me try a couple other things here. Now, let's see. For some reason, I'm still not getting the slideshow option. So let me...
Oh, that's bizarre. it's funny too. We were just doing this right before we jumped on, so
Right.
it shouldn't be.
There we go. Okay.
Got it.
Good news. Can you see my slideshow?
Not yet. There we go. There we go. Good deal.
You're getting my slideshow?
Yep.
Okay. So let me proceed. And let me assure you, I like feedback or comments and questions. So feel free to post any questions or comments in the chat boxes as we go along. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about the economics of highway spending and traffic congestion. And that is actually a very broad subject. So let's see what that, there we go. Okay, so we live in interesting times because for most of the last century, during the 20th century, automobile travel grew fairly steadily. So between 1900 and about the year 2000, if you were a traffic engineer, you could pretty much count on vehicle ownership and vehicle travel increasing pretty much every year. So during that period, it made sense to invest significant resources into accommodating growing vehicle travel demands. And so one of the key indicators of transportation system performance was whether we were building enough roads to accommodate that demand, or if we didn't, we were allowing the roads to get congested. So during the 20th century, it really did make sense to focus a lot of resources on addressing traffic congestion. However, just after the turn of the millennium, automobile travel started to peak. And this has occurred in developed countries around the world. It results from a combination of factors, including motor vehicle saturation, aging population, rising fuel prices, although we've seen that temporarily decline, but eventually we'll probably see it increase again. Increased urbanization, improved transport options, changing consumer preferences, health concerns, and environmental concerns. And all of these are contributing to the peaking of automobile travel and increasing demand for alternative modes. So one of the things that this perspective emphasizes is that it really does make sense to rethink a lot of our assumptions and practices regarding transportation planning in general, and in particular, the emphasis on expanding roads to accommodate increasing vehicle travel demands. And I'm not the only one that's saying this. A couple of years ago, The Economist magazine had an article called Seeing the Back of the Car, and it said, if policymakers are confident that car use is waning, they can focus on improving lives and infrastructure in areas already blighted by traffic rather than catering for future growth. This is the key message, that the planning practices that made sense during the 20th century really are not appropriate for the 21st century. And in particular, the emphasis on traffic congestion as the major transportation problem, and the emphasis on road building as the primary solution or primary way to improve transportation, those are outdated concepts. That's not to say they don't apply anywhere. There certainly are places where vehicle travel demand is likely to grow, especially in developing countries. And in some corridors, even in North America, it might make sense to expand a few roads, but the emphasis should change. And one particular important detail about this is that to some degree, the increasing vehicle travel and and increasing vehicle travel demands were a self-fulfilling prophecy. So during the 20th century, we spent a lot, there was increasing vehicle ownership and more automobile-oriented transport planning and reduced travel options, and alternative modes became stigmatized, and that led to more suburbanization and degraded cities and automobile-oriented land use planning and more generous parking supply and dispersed development patterns. All of these factors contributed to each other, creating this self-fulfilling prophecy or this self-reinforcing cycle. Now, almost all of those trends are starting to reverse, especially in affluent large cities. So what we're seeing is that per capita vehicle ownership is actually declining, and there's more emphasis on alternative modes that are improving our travel options, and people are now increasingly proud of relying on walking and cycling in public transit, and there's more urban infill, and all of these factors are contributing to a counter cycle from what we saw during the last century. So one thing that planners should be very conscious of is the risks of self-fulfilling prophecies, and this is a good example. So one of the perspectives that I think is very important is to understand a change in the way we think about transportation problems and evaluate solutions. That is a change in the transportation planning paradigm. And a big portion of this shift is changing from focusing on mobility, which is physical movement, to evaluating transportation in terms of accessibility, which means your ability to reach desired services and activities. What that means is, in the past, if we used a mobility-based paradigm, if we had traffic congestion, there was pretty much one solution, that is expand roads. We assumed that transportation meant driving, and increased driving was good, and that the main way to accommodate increased driving was through roadway expansions. An accessibility-based planning approach expands the potential solutions that we can apply to traffic congestion problems. For example, instead of expanding a highway between, let's say, a suburb and a downtown, instead we can think about encouraging people to use more space-efficient modes. So rather than accommodating 1,000 additional commuters using 1,000 cars, we can accommodate 1,000 additional commuters using, say, 50 buses or 150 van pools or something like that. We can also think about land use changes, what you can call smart growth, which brings more people living close to where they work. So you would encourage more affordable housing in the existing urban areas and more employment options in the suburbs. And so the accessibility-based planning really expands the potential solutions that we can apply to a problem like traffic congestion. And one detail of this is simply the way we define efficiency. So transportation engineers will say, we're trying to increase transportation system efficiency. Well, that's great. In the past, efficiency was defined based on vehicle travel. And so increasing efficiency meant reducing congestion delays. But if you look at a more network analysis, you might start increasing efficiency with things like improving roadway network connectivity, or multimodal planning asks, how can we improve the comfort and convenience of space-efficient modes, walking, cycling, ride-sharing, and public transit. And so we're getting more people through the existing road network. And accessibility-based planning defines efficiency in terms of people's ability to reach what they want. And so that takes into account land use factors like the distance between where people live and where they work or where they shop. And economic efficiency, it's a more complicated concept. It really thinks about in more detail, what are consumer demands, and are we meeting consumer demands? For example, there may be some people who would shift from driving to public transit if we improve the quality of public transit service. If, for example, buses were more comfortable and frequent, and you had onboard Wi-Fi service. And so you could say that serving those demands, the general term is consumer sovereignty, is a way to increase efficiency. And there's another perspective, and that is the efficiency of the planning process. So we could ask, is the planning process well integrated, say, between different modes and objectives and organizations, so that our individual short-term decisions support our strategic long-term goals? And those are all perspectives. When somebody uses the term efficiency, it's worthwhile to ask which type of efficiency are they focusing on, and maybe introduce some other perspectives that allow us to talk about efficiency in other ways. So I've done a lot of work looking at the way conventional planning evaluates congestion, traffic congestion, and how that could change if you use different definitions of efficiency or different perspectives. So for example, the well-known, often used report called the Urban Mobility Report, now it's called the Urban Mobility Survey or Index. It evaluates traffic congestion using what's called the travel time index, which is a measure of the additional delay during peak periods. So it compares travel speeds between peak and off-peak periods. What's interesting is if you measure traffic congestion costs, that is, you calculate per capita congestion delays, which I think is the proper index. It's the economic index rather than the engineering index. You get a very different ranking as to which US cities have the most severe traffic congestion. So the travel time index it measures the congestion intensity. That is the delay that occurs when somebody is driving under urban peak conditions. But it's not taking into account how many people are driving under urban peak conditions and how far they're driving. If you do take that into account, it turns out if you measure cities, if you evaluate cities based on the travel time index, compact cities tend to look worse. So New York ranks high in terms of congestion intensity, but people in New York are not driving as much during peak periods. They're either using alternative modes, or when they do drive, the distances tend to be short. So if you look at congestion cost, that is delays, hours of delay per capita or per commuter, it turns out the sprawled cities tend to be worse. So Houston, Atlanta, and Miami turn out to have higher congestion costs than New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. And so it is important. This is one example of the importance of being able to look at the way we evaluate congestion in different ways. Now, I've done quite a number of critiques of the Urban Mobility Report and identified what I consider to be a number of omissions and biases. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about that. At the end of this presentation, I'll provide some links to the reports where I critique them. But just to give you an example, the Urban Mobility Report, it measures, because of the way it measures congestion, it compares travel speeds between peak and off-peak periods. During off-peak periods, most travel is exceeding the speed limits. And so a good portion of what the Urban Mobility Report calculates as congestion costs is really just traffic complying with speed limits, with legal speed limits. And I believe that the urban mobility report significantly exaggerates the value of travel time and the benefits and the fuel consumption associated with traffic congestion and some other things. So I believe that the urban mobility report cost estimates should be considered the upper bound, and that more realistic assumptions result in much lower estimates of the costs. And to my disappointment, the authors of the urban mobility report have never acknowledged my critique, my suggestions for incorporating this kind of sensitivity analysis, or acknowledging some of the biases and omissions in their analysis. So it's going to be up to outsiders, people like you and me, to raise these questions when somebody quotes the urban mobility report as a source of congestion costs. So one interesting question is, how do congestion costs compare with other transportation costs? So even if you take the urban mobility report's upper range and you divide that by residents, it turns out traffic congestion is a mid level cost. Using my estimates, it costs somewhere between $110 and $390 per capita annually, depending on your assumptions. And even the highest estimate is actually moderate compared with other transportation costs. So I think this raises an important, for example, compared with what it costs consumers to own a car, or the monetized value of crashes, or vehicle operating costs, or the cost of parking, or even air pollution. So what this means, I believe, is that a congestion reduction strategy that increases these other costs is actually worth far less overall. But a congestion reduction strategy that reduces those other costs is worth far more. So a win-win congestion reduction strategy, that is a congestion reduction strategy that saves consumers money or reduces accidents or pollution or parking costs, is actually far better, far more economically justified than a congestion reduction strategy that provides no other benefits. Okay, so one of the factors that I think is really important to understand when evaluating congestion reduction strategies is to consider the impacts of generated traffic. Urban traffic congestion tends to maintain equilibrium. It gets bad enough that it prevents some potential peak period trips. If you expand roads, people will see the reduced congestion and will say, yeah, I'm going to take that trip across town to go shopping or to try a new restaurant. Traffic isn't very bad. And so soon the additional capacity fills up. Some of these additional trips, the additional peak period trips, are absolute increases in total vehicle travel. So we call that induced travel. And so there are a number of and let me just give an example. During the last decade, Texas spent billions of dollars to widen the Katy Freeway through Houston. It now totals about 23 total lanes in some of the areas, the world's widest freeway. And after it was opened in 2009, you did see a reduction in peak period congestion, but within a couple of years, that congestion returned, and it's actually worse than it was before the highway expansion. So this is an example, one example of the effects of generated traffic. So you can ask, what are the implications? What does this mean for urban transportation planning? And one thing is that traffic congestion seldom becomes as severe as predicted if you simply extrapolate past trends. And so when planners or when somebody says that within 5 years we're going to have absolute gridlock, they're probably exaggerating. It also means that roadway expansion provides less long-term congestion reduction benefits than predicted if by models that ignore generated traffic. And the induced vehicle travel increases various external costs, including downstream congestion, parking costs, accident risk, pollution emissions, and that reduces the net benefit. So you might, even if the roadway expansion provides, let's say, $10 million worth of congestion reduction, very likely it's increasing some other external costs by, let's say, $5 million a year. And it's true that the induced vehicle travel represents travel that people value. So there's a benefit to the people that do the additional driving. But this tends to be modest because it consists of the marginal value vehicle mileage that users are most willing to forego when their delay increases. So even though there's a benefit, and I'm not denying there's a benefit, that benefit tends to be modest. So this is important because the conventional planning process, it starts with these travel demand models that predict how much people are going to travel in the future and therefore the intensity of traffic congestion. And this tends to steer your transportation improvement dollars to expanding those roadways. And that's what we've been doing for the last century. And now it's time to challenge those models. So these models are very simplified, and they use simplistic assumptions about how much the amount of traffic, vehicle trips, or parking that will be generated in a particular area. And in practice, a lot of these recent research shows that a lot of these assumptions are highly biased. In particular, they greatly exaggerate the number of trips and vehicle ownership in smart growth transit-oriented communities. And so it's very important to challenge the model assumptions, particularly if you're advocating alternative modes or smart growth land use policies. Now, unfortunately, despite all these changes and the increasing demand for alternative modes, most transportation agencies have not got the memo yet. And so if you look at the forecasts that have been used, the official forecasts by major transportation organizations and agencies, most of them are still using some variation of extrapolating past trends. So both US and British travel forecasts have greatly exaggerated the amount of travel growth. For example, in the US DOT predicted that we would have about 4 trillion vehicle miles traveled every year by now. And we're now hovering right around 3. And so one of the key messages is that anytime somebody uses a model to predict severe future traffic congestion, it's worthwhile to look at their assumptions and to challenge them. Now, I'm going to talk about some of the research on some of the costs of expanding roads, of responding to traffic congestion by expanding roads. As I mentioned, there's good research showing that as roads are expanded, it induces additional vehicle travel. It tends to stimulate driving and sprawl and increases per capita vehicle travel. And one of the outcomes is that increases traffic fatalities, traffic accidents and fatalities. And there's good research showing that. A more positive way of saying that is US cities that are more transit-oriented, where people rely more on, relatively more on transit, tend to be much safer. There's also community economic impacts. It turns out of all the ways that consumers can spend their dollars, filling up the tank of your car with gas provides fewer regional jobs than almost any other type of expenditure. So to the degree that our automobile-oriented transportation planning stimulates more car ownership and automobile travel, and therefore causes consumers to spend more of their hard-earned dollars on their cars and fuel, you're reducing jobs in your community, or to put it more positively, by creating a more efficient multimodal transportation system and helping consumers spend less on vehicles and fuel, you're stimulating other types of industry in your community. And there's good research showing this. One of the interesting bits of research is that some people have looked at the relationship between traffic congestion and economic productivity, and it turns out it's positive, that cities that are more congested tend to be more productive. Now, that doesn't mean that congestion is necessarily good, but it does challenge the commonly held assumption that that reducing traffic congestion is good for the economy. In fact, this suggests that a lot of conventional congestion reduction strategies that stimulate more automobile travel and associated costs is actually quite harmful to the economy. There's another way to look at it, that economists would apply. A basic economic principle is that prices, that is what consumers pay for a good, should equal the marginal cost of producing that good unless a subsidy is specifically justified. When we expand urban highways, those are very expensive projects. They typically cost 50 cents to $2 per additional peak period vehicle trip mile accommodated. So if we were, if we want an economically efficient transportation system, we would charge tolls of that amount. What's interesting is when we apply tolls anywhere near that amount, the demand tends to plummet. And there are many recent roadway projects that are toll financed that have failed to achieve their traffic volumes and revenue targets. And what this means is that in many cases, the urban highway expansion projects are simply not cost effective. They're not economically justified. Motorists do want to use that additional capacity. They will use it, but only if it's highly subsidized, and not if they're actually if their demand for those additional peak period vehicle trips is challenged with cost-based pricing. So I think this raises from this perspective, there's a very strong case for applying tolls on existing roads as a way to reduce demand, and only expanding highways once the peak period toll revenue is great enough that it would really recover the cost of the expanded capacity. There's also some interesting, another perspective that's also interesting is looking at it from a social equity perspective. So when we propose that a particular roadway should be tolled, there's often resistance. People say, oh, that's unfair to the lower income motorists. But in fact, the vast majority of users tend to be middle and high income, and because vehicle travel tends to increase with income, in fact, financing urban roadway expansions is often regressive. That the source of the revenue, even if it's fuel taxes, whether it's fuel taxes or general taxes, tends to represent a cross subsidy from lower income people to the higher who are less likely to drive on urban roadways, to cross subsidize their neighbors who tend to be higher income, who do use that additional capacity. It's also very clearly unfair to invest primarily in roadway expansion for those people who rely on alternative modes, on more space-efficient modes, such as buses, van, and carpools, or who would if the roads were more efficiently priced. So there are probably a lot of people who do drive because currently automobile travel is underpriced and the quality of walking, cycling, and public transit is so poor. But if we had a more efficient system, there'd probably be many more people using those modes. So, for example, this means it makes a lot of sense to have dedicated bus lanes and HOV lanes, because then we're ensuring that users of space-efficient modes are not delayed by congestion that are caused by space-intensive modes. And there's also an inequity when we expand roads. It creates a barrier to walking and cycling, and since lower income people tend to rely more on walking and cycling, they're burdened by it. It's called the barrier effect. So I think that there are some good reasons or that an equity analysis provides good reasons to focus less on roadway expansion and more on alternative modes. So in some of my research, I do a comparison of different types of congestion reduction strategies. I compare roadway expansions with improving alternative modes, pricing reforms, smart growth land use policy, and TDM programs. And I acknowledge that all of them could reduce traffic congestion, but that if you look at the additional costs and benefits, the co-benefits, roadway expansion tends to stimulate indirect costs, where improving alternative modes, pricing reforms, smart growth, and TDM programs tend to have the greatest co-benefits. And I also point out that conventional models tend to exaggerate the benefits of highway expansion and underestimate the value of alternative modes. So, and other congestion reduction strategies. So I think this perspective is a starting point for being able to challenge the conventional roadway expansion emphasis. So I believe that there are some pretty bad congestion reduction solutions that are often being promoted. For example, expanding unpriced urban roadways may reduce congestion in the short run, but the additional capacity tends to be filled with latent demand and increases external costs. There are also some technologies that are occasionally proposed, such as half-width commuter vehicles. People are suggesting that we divide freeway lanes in half and sell these special vehicles that that a commuter could buy. It would fit into those half lanes, and that would double the roadway capacity, but it would require most households to buy an additional car, and those little vehicles are probably not quite as safe as a regular vehicle. And so you'd say that you're reducing traffic congestion costs, but you're increasing consumer costs and residential parking costs and accident costs. Another often proposed concept is the use of self-driving cars could be organized in a way into platoons, which allows more vehicles to squeeze into the highway. In my report, autonomous vehicle implementation projections, implications for transport planning, I go through some of the projections about how soon we're likely to see those kind of technologies. And I think most of us involved in the current planning are going to be dead before the technology that allows self-driving cars to operate efficiently and the public policies that dedicate special lanes to their use are widely implemented. So at least for the foreseeable future, I doubt that autonomous vehicles will do much to reduce traffic congestion. So there are very much better solutions, and my own analysis suggests that considering all impacts and planning objectives, that the first thing we do is to improve space-efficient travel options, walking, cycling, public transit, ride sharing, and telecommuting on congested urban corridors. And on those corridors, create dedicated lanes for the HOV and bus lanes and other public transit priority measures. And that we start applying congestion pricing on existing roads. And we implement other transport pricing reforms, such as more efficient road tolls and distance-based insurance and registration fees and increased fuel prices, because all of these tend to reduce traffic congestion, in addition to providing other benefits. And that we implement commute trip reduction programs and other mobility management programs that favor space-efficient modes, and only after all of those are fully implemented, if we find that there is still significant traffic congestion, we might consider expanding roadways, urban roadways, provided that they're financed through road tolls. A point I'd like to emphasize is that this, even though it does apply things like more efficient pricing and improvements to alternative modes, this is not anti-car. Motorists have every reason to support these strategies because they are effective traffic and parking congestion reduction strategies. They tend to increase motorist safety. They reduce motorist chauffeuring burdens. They provide mobility options that motorists might appreciate having sometime in the future, even if they don't use them now. And they tend to be much faster to implement than expanding roadways. A typical urban roadway project will take 5, 10, or 15 years to implement, and you could have most of those other congestion reduction strategies operating within 6 months or a year, 2 years at the most. So my conclusions are: traffic congestion is a moderate transportation cost overall, larger than some but smaller than others. Congestion reduction strategies are not cost effective if they increase vehicle, parking, accident, or pollution costs, but are far more beneficial to society if they reduce these other costs. Conventional evaluation practices tend to exaggerate congestion costs and roadway expansion benefits. More comprehensive evaluation tends to reduce the justification for roadway expansion and increase support for high quality transit, more efficient pricing, smart growth development policies, and other TDM strategies. Many current policies and planning practices result in economically excessive automobile travel and sprawl, which is inefficient and unfair. And the reforms, the congestion reduction strategies that I have recommended are not anti-car. Motorists can benefit overall from the strategies that create more diverse and efficient transportation systems. Now, that was a lot of information to cover, and if you want more information on anything that I presented, you can go to some of the related reports posted on our website, things like toward more comprehensive and multimodal planning and generated traffic implications for transport planning, and congestion costing critique and smart congestion relief. Okay, so I'm going to stop now and go back to my office here. So greetings to everybody, and I hope that that presentation was useful, and I am happy to take comments and questions.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Todd. This is wonderful. And there were a few questions that came up, and one of the first ones that came up, and I think this gives a chance to talk a little bit about some quick logistics. Someone asked about getting the slides, and I know you'd shared the PDF file with me, and I think what I'll do is I'll send an email out with a link to the recording of this webinar, with those slides you sent me, and then Todd, you'd mentioned you had a few links that you could send along as well.
Right. What I'll do is I'll send you a Word file with a bibliography on it. That's a list of my publications related to congestion analysis, and you can circulate it and post it as you see fit.
Okay, that sounds good. And then one of the questions that came up too is if you had a source, some of the, where are we going to find some of the sources for some of the data? Like one of the questions was on the job creation data.
Right. Well, that's in my reports. So you would have to find the right report. If you're looking for a particular detail, then you could send me an email. But in particular, that one is Eric Dumbaugh. He's a professor, I think, in Florida, one of the universities in Florida, who's written a number, who blogs regularly on some of these related subjects. And so you might just do a search on his postings related to traffic congestion and GDP or economic productivity. And I think you'll find that his work is widely cited, so I think it should be pretty easy to track down.
Okay, that's really helpful. A few more questions I'm seeing on the Q&A screen here. Richard asks, what portion of the money spent on car trips leaves the local economy, and then how does that compare to other modes?
Right. Well, that's a hot issue. And the more research I do, the more evidence there is of the very low, what's called multiplier effect, economic multiplier effect of expenditures, particularly on fuel, but also on vehicles. And that's because very likely in your town there are no oil wells and no oil refineries and no car manufacturers. And even if there was a car assembly plant in your city, very likely, or most of the inputs in those vehicles, or a good portion of those inputs, are coming from someplace else. And so, at best, your city might be assembling cars, but not really manufacturing cars. So, the tool that economists use is called an input-output table or regional economic model. And unfortunately, I've only been able, I actually commissioned one of these studies that looked at this at one point. And then in my slide, I showed that expenditures on fuel, these models indicate that expenditures on fuel, $1 million spent on gasoline generates about 5 jobs, as opposed to 10 to 15 for general consumer expenditures, and about 20 or 25 for expenditures on public transit. But since then, we've looked back at the assumptions that went into those 5 jobs per million expenditures, and it turns out the model appears to consider gas stations as fully financed by gasoline sales. And in fact, gas stations make very little profit on gasoline these days. Their main profit center are things like junk food and maps and other things they sell, and also lottery tickets and things like that. They're essentially convenience stores. Most gas stations now, the pumps are fully automated, or there might be one clerk operating a dozen pumps, collecting money from a dozen pumps. And so my guess is that 5 jobs per million expenditures is way overstated for modern. That was based on a 20-year-old assumptions. I don't think that it's true anymore. So there's very good reasons to think that people spending money on gasoline is very harmful to their local economy. But I'm still waiting for somebody to do a good study that allows us that quantifies this and allows us to cite real solid numbers on it. But the research I've done suggests that, for example, if we can help households go from owning 2 cars to 1 car, and therefore they're spending, let's say, $2,000 a year less on petroleum, that is probably very, if that's a broad, if that effect occurs to many households, that's very good for your local economy.
That makes a lot of sense. So another question we had is, when is a bus rapid transit project a bad idea? And the economic effects of construction on corridor merchants.
Right. Well, this is a hot issue.
Mm-hmm.
Last year, I presented a paper at the Threadbow conference, a conference on a public transit planning conference in beautiful Santiago, Chile, titled "When Are Bus Lanes Warranted?" It's posted on our website, so you just go to vtpi.org and you can read it. And my research or my analysis suggests that anytime you have more than about 20 buses per peak hour, you can justify a dedicated bus lane, because that lane is carrying more people than a general traffic lane. So 20 buses per hour after, now here's the key, is that's 20 buses per hour after you've, this bus lane has been in operation for a couple years and is supported with other TDM, transportation demand management strategies, such as commute trip reduction programs at work sites and improved walkability and other things that encourage people to use buses. So that I believe is a much lower trigger warrant than what most communities are applying. And in particular, I think a lot of cities, if you've been following what occurred in Wilshire Boulevard in Los Angeles, the local government refused to put in a bus rapid transit lane, and I think they're perpetuating automobile-oriented planning and overlooking the various factors that I think justify more emphasis and more bus priority strategies. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, David mentioned a little bit on, I guess, the economic effects of construction on corridor merchants. I would assume that's
right. Any project can be disruptive, although in most cases, BRT is it can be implemented far faster, cheaper, and easier than, say, a rail transit system. And so, just as an example, I did a little bit. I had a small role to play in the Vancouver's 2010 Olympics, Winter Olympics, and to make the planning for the Olympics is great fun, because it's logistics at its most. It's logistics at its most basic. You're guaranteeing that you're going to transport tens of thousands of people every day from one site to another, or to a site, with all their support services. And it gave me a tremendous appreciation for coach buses. In this particular case, we had to guarantee that we would transport, I believe it was 30,000 people from Vancouver up to Whistler, which is one of the venues, every day. 30,000 people up and back on a highway that in some places is only 2 lanes. And we could do that because the Olympic managers, the Olympic planners, gained control. They had absolute control over that highway, and so it was limited to the to Olympic vehicles, and particularly these coach buses, these fleets of coach buses. And if you have a few hundred coach buses, you can transport tens of thousands of people on a very reliable basis. So in order to make it work, the whole for travel around Vancouver, that is, say, from the skating rinks and the hockey sites and all that, to make that work, some of the urban arterials in Vancouver became Olympic lanes. So during the 17 days of the Olympics, the Olympic managers had control over those lanes, and Vancouver never operated more smoothly than during that period, because because those Olympic lanes carried very high volumes of people in public transit and special dedicated vehicles. But then after the Olympics were over, they allowed the lanes to go back to general traffic lanes, and they lost that efficiency. So my conclusion is most cities in the world could benefit significantly by creating a network of dedicated bus lanes or dedicated HOV lanes on most major arterials, so it becomes as fast or faster to get around the city by public transit, by bus, as it is by automobile, especially during peak periods. Very few cities are doing that, and that, I think, is a real failure. You could say that this is why we have such bad traffic congestion, is that a bus that's carrying 50 people is delayed by congestion as much as a car that's carrying one person. And so bus lanes greatly increase efficiency. Now, that brings us back to this discussion. You know, local merchants, as you say, are often very reluctant to give up road space and parking spaces. And we have to remind them, cars don't have wallets, people have wallets. Merchants are interested in wallets. And so we need to do a better job of showing the overall economic benefits of creating a more efficient transportation system. It's a big issue for bicycling. I'm sure you're familiar with, you know, efforts to put in bike lanes that are opposed by merchants. And consistently we're able to show that when you do the analysis, that the merchants are actually better off, because partly because bicyclists and pedestrians and transit users actually do tend to spend more in local commercial centers per month, not necessarily per trip, but per month. And a parking space, or a particular piece of land that's dedicated to bicycle parking, generates far more revenue, local revenue, than that same space used for car parking. And these strategies that reduce households' need to own and operate cars leaves them with more money to spend on these other goods. So, you know, very likely the restaurants in particular, and the brew pubs and local shops could do better if their customers are spending less money on cars and therefore have more money to spend on other goods.
Yeah, it's a multi-dimensional effect, and like you said, I love that cars don't have wallets. Here's a question from Jim Noteware in Houston, Texas, and I'm just going to read this one. It's a little long. It's a good question. He says, my question is relative to the cycle for auto growth and the reversal of that cycle this century. If traffic demand is reducing, won't congestion reduce as well? But more importantly, roads and highways deteriorate over time, so public officials must decide how to maintain and repair roads with ever decreasing funds. Leaving aside creation of new roadways, will we ever see eliminating some current roads in order to focus maintenance funds on higher volume roads? In other words, application of triage, letting some roads die.
Right. Well, there are several different issues there. One is that the main message, my main message is that automobile travel is, per capita automobile travel has peaked. But especially in cities where you get significant population growth, you could end up with significant increase in total vehicle trips. But the point I want to make is that that growth is really contingent. It isn't outside of transportation planners' control. When we build an automobile-oriented transportation system, we're stimulating automobile travel. So in particular, things like the subsidized parking, ensuring that there's plenty of parking everywhere is, as Don Shoup describes it, a fertility drug for cars. And similarly, if we invest in roads but fail to maintain walking and cycling and public transit, we're essentially ensuring that the travel demand will be served by automobile trips. But a community can choose otherwise. A community could decide that they're going to implement demand management and smart growth policies and reduce total vehicle trips. And if you've been following it, the state of California has now committed to new planning practices that are designed to do that. So there'll be more policy support for strategies that reduce automobile trip generation. So you could say that it's really up to cities to decide, or up to a particular jurisdiction to decide how much vehicle travel they're going to have, and therefore how much traffic congestion. My main point is that the conventional planning models, the travel demand models, and the funding practices that we've put into place for the last century, they are great. They tend to greatly exaggerate the severity of traffic congestion problems. They're based on the assumption, or they evaluate overall transportation system performance on the ease of driving. And so they use roadway level of service as their primary indicator of the quality of travel, and therefore the priorities for improving urban transportation systems. And that, I believe, is all wrong. So we can start challenging that. We can challenge their traffic growth projections. We can challenge the assumption that roadway expansion is really a good solution. We can challenge their assumptions that consumers really want to drive. These are all, and we can challenge the assumption that there's any overall economic benefit from automobile-oriented solutions. That's not to say that cities, that in the future everybody's going to give up driving. Not at all. According to my research, even in a smart growth city, something like 1/3 to 50% of trips should be made by automobile. It's now lower percentages, say, in the urban core, but for urban region overall, automobiles are probably going to be the largest mode share, even with sustainability or sustainable transportation planning. But the point is, it's on the major urban corridors, that is the corridors where traffic congestion is most severe. That's where the justification for the improving alternative modes and demand management strategies to limit automobile travel should be focused. Yeah. And yes, there are some really good examples of cities that are removing major highways, major urban highways, and are doing quite well as a result. You might be familiar with the beautiful example in Seoul, South Korea, the Embarcadero in San Francisco, and many road diet projects that are incrementally reducing the number of urban arterial traffic lanes.
Well,
and this is all possible if you use a comprehensive program that includes improving the space-efficient modes and demand management strategies and smart growth. Yes.
Yeah, and like you'd said earlier, Todd, too, you know, these strategies end up benefiting people driving cars as much. So they're not, you know, you're not talking about necessarily an anti-car approach. One question we have, and this actually came up during the chat while you were presenting as well. What aspects are considered under the fuel externalities figure that you used in the presentation? Right.
Well, this is an interesting thing. This is my career began when I did my master's thesis that was a comprehensive analysis of the various costs of different forms of transportation, and therefore the potential savings and benefits if people shift from automobile to alternative modes or reduce their total vehicle travel. And when I started on this, there is literature on these various costs over the last 2 decades since my thesis was completed. There's been a lot more. But what's really interesting is when we talk about externalities, most people assume we're talking about environmental externalities. And my research actually suggests that the environmental externalities are modest. The biggest ones are things like parking subsidies, traffic accident risks that one vehicle imposes on others, and under urban peak conditions, traffic congestion. Those are the big externalities. Air pollution certainly is an externality, but I think an awful lot of people, they get caught focusing on environmental externalities, and I think that's to our disadvantage. Let me rephrase that. If we want to support these policy reforms, things like dedicated bus lanes, more investments in high quality public transit, more investments in walking and cycling, more efficient pricing of roads and parking facilities, commute trip reduction programs, those are often presented as primarily air pollution reduction strategies or congestion reduction strategies. And that's good. They do help reduce those problems, but you're greatly understating the total benefits of something like a bus-only lane if you don't take into account the savings to consumers. That is, if having really high-quality public transit in your neighborhood allows some households to go from owning 2 cars to 1 car, or 1 car to 0 cars, those households are saving $4,000 or $5,000 a year. And conventional models don't take that into account. So there's an affordability benefit. That's actually an internal benefit. It's a benefit to users, but it's a very significant benefit that's leveraged by, you could say it's an affordability benefit that's leveraged by improving alternative modes. And also when those commuters shift from driving to work to using public transit, they're reducing parking costs. And that's a huge savings that conventional economic models totally overlook, and a lot of environmentalists overlook. Thank goodness for Don Shoup and his great publications on this, which is introducing a greater understanding. Let me ask you this. What do you think the average value of a parking space is? If you were to calculate the annualized value of a typical urban parking space, what do you think it is?
I can't, you know, I've actually read this. I should know. I can't remember offhand. What is it?
Well, let's say somewhere between $500 and $1,500, and much higher for those structured parking. You know, if you're talking about a parkade or a garage or an underground parking space, it's actually about $3,000 a year. But let's just assume that a typical parking space is about $1,000 a year annualized cost. How many parking spaces do you think? How many off-street parking spaces are there per car?
I like 3.
Yeah, that's overall probably about 3. somewhat less in very dense urban areas where people rely more on shared parking, and somewhat more in sprawled areas where you need a separate parking space at every destination. You can't share the parking. But let's say 3. So there are typically $3,000 in parking costs per automobile. And for those city center parking spaces, the structured parking, a lot of cars are worth less than the parking space they're occupying. So you've got a $50,000 parking space that's occupied by a $20,000 car. And you've got the average car has that every time somebody buys a car, they're expecting somebody else to pay about as much as they paid for that car for parking spaces. That there are probably more value to the parking spaces than for the car. So it would actually be more efficient to give away cars and charge for parking everywhere than what we currently do, which is charge for cars, but then give away parking spaces. So that's an example of one of the huge subsidies or external costs that often get overlooked. Similarly, traffic accident risk, another impact, external impact, is that most of our discussion about traffic congestion is looking at the delay that a motor vehicle imposes on other motor vehicles. The barrier effect refers to the delay that motor vehicles impose on pedestrians and cyclists, that wider roads and increased vehicle travel make it difficult to cross the street. And so by all rights, there should be an equal analysis of the barrier effect costs. That's an externality associated with automobile travel. And it shows up in things like families having to buy a second car so mom can drive the kids to school because they don't feel safe allowing the children to walk to school because so many other moms are driving their kids to school. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. And so until recently, we had no name for this. It's the barrier effect. And by my analysis, it's actually a significant cost. It's not a huge cost, but it's one of those costs that should be taken into account when we do analysis, and especially when we analyze the full impacts of expanding roads.
Sure, certainly a cost worth measuring, and I mean, it might also be a family getting a third car for the high school kids, so they don't have to drive the kid all over the place. And actually, so the conversation about parking and about driving to school is actually segues really nicely. And we've got a few questions to get to, so we'll try to maybe roll through these. But it segues into a question from Tim Davis. He asked, how do we address transportation and placemaking in our suburbs where the overwhelming majority of Americans and Canadians live? He said, I love focusing on cities, but we have to address the suburban Ponzi scheme. Is there anything we can do to make suburbs more efficient?
Absolutely. And I think actually many suburbs are now trying to urbanize. They see the value. And I think, your strong towns, I think, is probably working with a lot of these communities that started off as pure bedroom communities, and now they're realizing they want to diversify their tax base. They want to have more services that meet people's needs. They want to attract some businesses, so they have local employment. They want to accommodate more diverse. They want to create more diverse housing options to accommodate more types of households. And in particular, a lot of suburbs are now thinking in terms of aging in place. So they realize that all those nice people that moved to the suburbs during their middle, when they were raising a family, now they're beginning to think about downsizing. And some of them will need care facilities of various sorts. And the question is, do they leave that community where they just spent the last couple decades of their lives, and that's so important, and they have lots of friends. When it's time to move into a condominium and then to a care facility, are those types of housing in their communities, or are they going to have to move away? And I think and I've worked with quite a few communities that are starting to struggle with this. And I think it's actually a very positive message. The positive message is that a suburban community is going to be better off overall if it creates a downtown, a commercial center that is a true downtown, not just a shopping mall, but a true downtown that is a walkable center with mixed use. So there's at least some housing, including affordable housing, in that walkable center, so that when it is time for residents of those single family housing to downsize, that they can stay in that community, and their dollars, their retirement dollars, will stay in their community.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. I'm really glad you brought up the aging in place too, because I think that's that's an area where the suburbs probably have some innate advantages in some ways.
I think there are models to do it in all kinds of communities. So in a small rural village, you can make sure that, let's say, the small rural village with only 1,000 residents at least has a pharmacy and a grocery store and some affordable housing right there, and a coffee shop, for old people to hang out, that it has the services that people use most frequently, that right there in a walkable center. That's the key.
Sure.
I think it's a positive message. It also ties in, of course, with the concerns about public health and people being able to exercise as a daily activity. Often, our world is increasingly commodified. That is, pretty much somebody's going to try and sell you a solution to pretty much every problem you identify. And when it comes to public fitness and health, the idea is we're all supposed to join a gym and work out. In truth, most people will only do that when they're young and going out on dates. But once you couple up, very few people will continue to exercise at a gym regularly. If we want, and especially the people who are already overweight and sedentary. So if you think of public fitness from an overall public health perspective, the real key is to create these walkable neighborhoods. That's really essential, as I'm sure you know. And so again, it gives us a positive message to say to those suburbs that if you do a good job of building sidewalks on your roads and having a walkable downtown and adding some affordable housing in that downtown, that you're really providing health and wealth and happiness.
Sure. I think that's great. And like you said, it's a positive message. Jim Noteware in Houston has another good question. He notes that it seems transit officials often respond to congestion. I'm sure we've all seen this, by jumping to fixed rail systems that are, of course, very expensive and inflexible. So he asked, how do we motivate improved consideration of better bus service, van pooling, other related systems, since they do appear in many cases to be faster, cheaper, and ultimately more flexible?
Sure. Well, when it comes to the big debate between buses and train and rail transit, I'm actually agnostic. I can argue both sides, because it is true that high quality rail, if it's properly integrated into a community, provides extra benefits. That is, if the rail can be more of a catalyst for transit-oriented development than, I think, buses. Now, one little detail is that hopefully within the next decade or so, we will finally get cleaner and quieter diesel engines. But even the current generation of diesel buses are still pretty noisy and stinky. And so I think that's actually one of the major disadvantages of bus rapid transit compared with rail. So this is one area where I think there is some potential for technical solutions. Simply, I don't even think we have to go to, say, electric buses. I think that there's significant potential improvements just in the design of bus engines to make them quieter. And that if we did that and we used good design, that a lot of BRT systems could achieve, let's say, 75% of the overall benefits as rail. Currently, I think they can only provide about 50%. So that's still,
it's to the economic catalyst of like transit-oriented development, that sort of thing, correct?
Yeah, think of it this way. What does it take to allow households to reduce their vehicle ownership? So there's good research now, a lot of it coming out just in the last couple of years, showing that residents of transit-oriented neighborhoods own about half as many cars and generate about half as many vehicle trips as they would in more conventional sprawled automobile-oriented areas. There's some debate as to how much of that is self-selection, that the people who don't want to own a car are choosing the transit-oriented areas, but there's pretty good research showing that at least that transit-oriented development reduces at least 30% and in many cases up to 50% of households' vehicle ownership and trips, compared with those same households locating in conventional automobile-oriented sprawl. So that's a huge set of benefits. It's benefits to the household, financial savings, it's reduced traffic and parking congestion to local governments and businesses, it's reduced accidents and air pollution, and increased public fitness and health. So all of these benefits result from the leverage effect that high quality transit has on land use, on the types of neighborhoods that develop around the stations. And that's where pretty consistently rail is much more effective than buses. Although I think it is important to go back and ask, what are the exact features of rail that make that happen? And to what degree can we replicate that with buses, with BRT? And I do think that there's an awful lot that can be done to improve bus service and the integration of bus stations as activity centers. But there's, especially when you start having more than, say, 15,000 peak period passengers on a corridor, I think that you can start justifying rail. And if your community is seriously committed to the transit-oriented development model, that again, I think there's often a case for rail.
Sure, and then it's you kind of alluded to it earlier. As far as Jim asking about ways to kind of make the case for for some more bus transit or high frequency lanes. You'd suggested earlier, one of the things that is helpful with those type of systems is you can implement them fairly quickly.
Absolutely, I'm a great supporter of bus rapid transit. I'm doing a lot of international work, that's essentially justifies it. In this paper that I gave at Threadbow, that was all about building support for bus rapid transit lanes. So I'm a great supporter, but it's still, I'm not anti-rail, and I do recognize that in some circumstances, rail can be justified. So it's really, like many planning questions, the answer is, it depends.
Yeah, no, I think that makes sense. I feel the same way. I think people get into their camps too much, and you got to look at it situation by situation. And also, someone pointed out in the comments, and I totally agree with this too, is part of the issue with BRT sometimes is that we don't actually end up doing BRT. We end up doing kind of a poor bastardized version of it that, and then of course don't get all the benefits that you might. It looks like we're pretty much through questions. I'll get to one more, and then maybe we'll wrap it up here. And I want to be respectful of your time and everybody who's attending this time. David had a follow-up question. He'd asked earlier about the just some of the issues with construction when you put in a new transit system. And he's wondering, are there any strategies to support local merchants, during the period of construction, that you've seen that work well, or that are worthwhile, or is it sort of just have to grin and bear it until the project's done and then reap the benefits afterwards?
Yeah, it's again, it all depends. So I'm sure there are some additional strategies that can be applied. It's no different than any other roadway project, really. Most cases, road project is disturbing to an area. And so a bus lane or whatever is going to be disturbing. I guess one of the things to emphasize with BRT is that pedestrian improvements are always an integrated part of a good transit, bus transit improvement. And pedestrian improvements do tend to benefit local merchants. And so there may be ways that you can sort of highlight to the merchants the overall long-term benefits. I posted one of my Planet Isn't blogs a couple years ago, looked at this question of the economic impacts of bike lanes, and summarized the literature showing that bike lanes often increase overall economic activity in an urban commercial district. It would be interesting to apply that kind of analysis to bus lanes, but every situation is unique. The issue that they usually get caught up on is any loss of parking spaces. Yeah. And we point out that cars don't have wallets, people have wallets. And so the question is not, it is absolutely wrong to assume that the loss of a parking space results in a comparable loss in retail activity. In most cases, it's easy. There are ways to manage the remaining parking spaces more efficiently, and so we're guaranteeing that motorists can still find a parking space, and we're improving access for pedestrians and cyclists and transit users. So if a good project should really, a good bike or bus lane project can often increase overall merchant retail activity in an area. Also, if that bus route becomes a catalyst for more transit-oriented development, so developers start building more condos or more office facilities in that area, then those are more wallets for those merchants. And so the merchants should be particularly supportive of anything that increases the total number of people living in their area. In fact, my next research project, my current research project, which I hope to complete in the next couple of weeks, is called Selling Smart Growth. And one component of it will be to communicate to merchants and businesses the benefits to them of having more compact development as opposed to more sprawl development. And one of the components is simply that you have more customers nearby. And an associated aspect is that those customers will be spending less on transportation, so they have more money to spend on other goods, including housing and groceries. Or to put it differently, when there's these huge subsidies for alcohol, for ethanol in gasoline. So when I drive my car, my ethanol is subsidized. When I go to my local brew pub and consume some ethanol, it's highly taxed. It's a very unfair, it's a modal bias in favor of driving in terms of ethanol policy. And that's one example. My city here in Victoria, British Columbia, does not have any oil wells or oil refineries, but we have lots of brew pubs. So if I spend less money on gasoline for my car, and instead I'm out there walking and bicycling, and I spend more money, I can drink more beer because I'm burning it off with all that walking and cycling. I'm generating local jobs.
Exactly, and doing it safely. And as a big fan of craft brew, I can definitely support that.
Okay, well, when you come and visit me here in Victoria, we'll have to sample the full array of ethanol options.
I am absolutely game. That sounds great. And I'm glad we got to that question too, because I think that it is something that comes up, and I think maybe it's just probably because of the paradigm of kind of auto-oriented development we've been in for six plus decades, is people's first instinct is to think, oh, if I lose that parking spot, or oh, if we lose a lane to autos, that it's gonna hurt our business or hurt our merchants. But you make some multiple points, right? It's not just one or two things. There's multiple points that show that over the long term, this is great for merchants and great for our community. So I'm glad you went into that. And definitely make sure you share that report with us when you get that done. I think that'd be great to share. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thank you so much. I will let you go, Todd. And thank you everybody for joining us. And like I said, we'll send out an email with a link to the recording, link to the slides, and then Todd's got some links he'll send me to share with you as well. And you'll have all sorts of great information to look over. So really appreciate it, and definitely encourage you to check out Todd's site, vpti.org. All right, thank you very much. Really appreciate it.
Thank you all.
Take care.